At first glance, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. might seem like opposites, one fiery and uncompromising, the other calm and rooted in peace. But beneath their differences lay a shared and unshakable vision, a world where Black Americans could live with dignity, safety, and equality. Both men stood against the same mountain of injustice. They simply chose different paths to climb it. Martin Luther King Jr., guided by his deep Christian faith, believed that love was the most powerful weapon of all. He dreamed of a nation where people would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His marches, speeches, and acts of peaceful resistance were not signs of weakness, they were acts of immense courage. Facing police brutality, arrests, and threats, King never lost sight of his mission: to awaken America's conscience through moral strength and nonviolence. Malcolm X, on the other hand, rose from a life scarred by racism and poverty. He saw firsthand how deeply hate and inequality were woven into the system. His early message was one of self-defense and pride, a call for Black people to stand tall, to reclaim their identity, and to reject submission. To Malcolm, equality could not be begged for. It had to be demanded. He refused to accept that nonviolence alone could solve centuries of oppression. Yet, what united them was far more powerful than what set them apart. Both sought freedom. Both challenged America to confront its hypocrisy. Both inspired millions to believe that change was possible, not someday, but now. And both ultimately paid the price for their courage with their lives. Their shared dream was not just about civil rights. It was about human rights, the right to exist freely, to speak bold, and to live without fear. They were two voices echoing one truth: that liberation required not only breaking chains but changing hearts. Today, their legacy reminds us that the fight for justice has many paths. Whether through compassion or confrontation, progress is built by those who refuse to remain silent. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were not rivals in spirit. They were brothers in struggle, united by courage, and an unyielding faith in humanity's potential to rise above hate. If their stories move you, if you believe their message still matters today, do not let it fade. Keep the conversation alive. Like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that reveal the real history behind the headlines. Together, we can continue the work they began, understanding, educating, and inspiring change. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, the world began to witness two contrasting forces rise from the same fire of injustice. On one side stood Martin Luther King Jr., the preacher from Atlanta who carried a message of peace and forgiveness even in the face of hatred. On the other stood Malcolm X, the man who had transformed pain and anger into fierce determination, a voice that thundered through the walls of oppression. Their philosophies diverged, yet both were driven by the same force: the unyielding belief that the time for freedom was long overdue. Martin Luther King Jr. believed that nonviolence was not only a tactic but a way of life. To him, peaceful resistance was the most powerful way to expose the cruelty of racism without becoming a mirror of it. He urged his followers to march with dignity, to meet hatred with steadfast calm, to let the world see the injustice laid bare in the violence of their oppressors. In places like Birmingham and Selma, he showed the nation that nonviolence was not passive surrender but active moral defiance. Each speech, each demonstration, was a call for America to awaken its conscience and recognize the humanity of those it had long ignored. King's voice carried a rhythm that stirred hearts, echoing through churches, streets, and across television screens. He did not promise an easy road. He offered a moral one, and that, he believed, was the only path that could heal a wounded nation. Meanwhile, Malcolm X stood before audiences with a different fire. His words were sharp, unapologetic, and deeply rooted in the reality of black life in America. Having endured the pain of seeing his family destroyed by racial violence and his youth consumed by the streets, he refused to accept patience as a solution. To him, peace without justice was meaningless, and promises without action were lies. He urged his people to love themselves fiercely, to embrace their identity, and to defend their dignity by any means necessary. Where King sought reconciliation, Malcolm demanded recognition. His voice carried the urgency of a man who had seen too much suffering to believe in gradual change. The media often painted them as opposites, two leaders divided by ideology, yet the truth was far more complex. Both men were products of their experiences, and both sought the same end: true freedom. They were two rivers flowing from the same mountain, taking different courses but heading toward the same sea. King wanted to transform America from within, using compassion to reach the nation's heart. Malcolm, shaped by betrayal and injustice, wanted to empower his people first, to make them strong enough to stand on their own. As the years passed, their paths began to bend toward each other. Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca changed him profoundly. For the first time, he saw Muslims of every color praying side by side, treating one another as equals. The experience shattered the racial boundaries he once believed were unbreakable. When he returned, he spoke of unity, of building bridges, and of finding strength in common humanity. Though still a fierce advocate for black pride and justice, his tone carried a new wisdom, one that echoed King's message of shared struggle. At the same time, Martin Luther King Jr. was evolving too. The years of nonviolent protest had brought victories, but also bitter lessons. The Civil Rights Act had passed, yet poverty and inequality still chained black communities. The dream of racial harmony seemed to drift further away as violence and frustration grew. King began to speak out not only against racism, but also against economic injustice and the Vietnam War. His message widened beyond the struggle for civil rights to the fight for human rights, a battle against all forms of oppression, whether in America or abroad. He had seen that moral persuasion alone could not dismantle systems built on greed and power. In those final years, their messages began to echo one another more than ever before. Both recognized that real freedom required more than laws. It demanded transformation in hearts, in policies, in the very structure of society. King, once seen as the dreamer, had grown more radical in his challenge to the nation's conscience. Malcolm, once the symbol of defiance, had found a path toward reconciliation without surrender. They had walked separate journeys but arrived at a shared truth: that the struggle for equality was not a battle between peace and resistance, but a union of both. Though they met only once, briefly and almost by chance, that moment has become a symbol, a fleeting intersection of two giants who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their missions were intertwined. They knew that change needed both the hand that reached out in love and the fist that demanded respect. Together, they embodied the full spectrum of resistance: moral and militant, spiritual and strategic, hopeful and unyielding. Their stories remind us that movements are never one-dimensional. Progress is rarely peaceful and never perfect. It requires dreamers like King, who dare to believe in humanity's better nature, and fighters like Malcolm, who refuse to accept anything less than justice. One challenged the nation to rise above hate through love. The other challenged it to face its truth through strength. Both were necessary. Both were right in their own way. The contrast between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X was never just about methods, it was about how pain and hope shaped two men to see the same struggle through different lenses. Both came from worlds carved by hardship, yet both believed deeply that freedom was not a dream to wait for, but a right to claim. Their stories intertwine like two halves of the same heartbeat, pulsing through the history of a nation struggling to define its soul. Martin Luther King Jr. was raised in a stable family surrounded by faith, education, and the moral teachings of the church. From a young age, he learned that love could conquer hate, that compassion could transform even the hardest hearts. His sermons carried the warmth of belief that redemption was possible not just for individuals, but for an entire society. When he spoke from the pulpit or led marches through the streets, his voice carried more than eloquence. It carried the weight of moral authority. His dream was not naive optimism, but a challenge to a country built on contradictions, a call for America to live up to its own promise of equality. Malcolm X's journey was forged in fire. His childhood was marked by violence and loss. His father killed under mysterious circumstances. His family torn apart by poverty and discrimination. While King studied theology, Malcolm spent his youth in survival mode, drifting through crime and prison before finding purpose in the Nation of Islam. From that crucible, he emerged with an unbreakable will, a man who refused to bow, who spoke the truth that many feared to utter. He told Black Americans to stand tall, to stop waiting for acceptance from a system built to exclude them. To those who felt unseen and unheard, his words were liberation. He offered pride where shame had lived, power where fear had ruled. Though the media cast them as rivals, their paths were never truly opposed. King believed that love could melt the barriers of hate, while Malcolm believed that power could break them. One sought to awaken the conscience of the oppressor. The other sought to awaken the strength of the oppressed. Yet, both understood the same underlying truth, that the fight for equality was not just a political struggle, but a moral awakening. They were two reflections of the same desire: dignity, security, and the right to live as human beings, not as victims. When Malcolm journeyed to Mecca, his worldview began to expand beyond race. Witnessing people of all colors praying together, he saw that unity was possible without surrendering identity. He returned with a renewed faith in the human spirit, now speaking of brotherhood rather than separation. The fire within him was still fierce, but it had been tempered by wisdom. Meanwhile, King, who had once believed that the American dream could be redeemed through moral appeal, began to see that love alone could not dismantle deeply rooted inequality. His vision grew bolder, extending beyond civil rights to challenge economic exploitation and war. He saw that injustice anywhere was indeed a threat to justice everywhere, whether in the slums of Chicago or the villages of Vietnam. Their lives began to move in parallel lines, drawing closer as they matured. Both were confronting not only external enemies but internal ones: disillusionment, exhaustion, the weight of being symbols rather than men. They each faced criticism from their own supporters. King accused of being too moderate, Malcolm accused of being too extreme. Yet both pressed on, understanding that history rarely honors those who choose comfort over conviction. When they finally met briefly in 1964, the moment was electric. It was not the dramatic confrontation the press had imagined, but a brief handshake filled with mutual respect. In that instant, two philosophies touched not to compete, but to recognize one another. It was as if history itself paused to take a breath, acknowledging that both peace and resistance were necessary parts of the same struggle. Within a few short years, both men would fall to assassins' bullets, their lives cut short but their legacies immortal. Their deaths were not the end of their influence. They became symbols of different forms of courage. King's dream continued to echo in the push for nonviolent change, inspiring generations to march, speak, and vote. Malcolm's fire burned in movements that demanded pride, ownership, and power. Together, they taught the world that progress requires both the hand that reaches out and the fist that will not yield. Looking back now, it becomes clear that their differences were not divisions, but complements. King's compassion softened the heart of a nation. Malcolm's strength demanded that the nation act. Without King, the movement might have lacked a moral compass. Without Malcolm, it might have lacked its backbone. Both taught that freedom has a price not just in sacrifice, but in persistence. They were two voices harmonizing across the same melody, one of justice, dignity, and self-respect. Their lives remind us that history's greatest battles are never fought on a single front. True change requires balance, courage and compassion, peace and pressure, heart and discipline. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X is not about conflict between two men, but about the harmony that can emerge when different paths converge toward the same purpose. Their messages still ring with power today, urging us to stand for what is right in a world that often chooses what is easy. They challenge us to act with both love and strength, to see beyond division, and to carry forward the dream that both died defending. Their spirits live on in every act of truth, every march for justice, every voice that refuses to be silenced. As the struggle for civil rights unfolded across the United States, the stories of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X grew ever more intertwined, not by coincidence but by the gravity of the movement itself, which demanded both the courage to dream and the courage to confront reality. The contrast between the two men, so often portrayed by the media as a simple dichotomy of peaceful versus militant, belied a far deeper connection. Each was trying, in his own way, to awaken the nation to its moral and social failures while giving strength and hope to a community long denied both. King's path was shaped by a profound belief in the transformative power of nonviolence. He saw it not as passivity, but as a deliberate and courageous strategy, one that required a steadfast commitment to justice even in the face of immense personal danger. His speeches, imbued with a lyrical eloquence, reached beyond the immediate moment, speaking to the conscience of the nation itself. Every march he led, every sit-in he supported, was a carefully measured act of moral pressure designed to expose the contradictions between America's ideals and its reality. His vision was expansive, a society where children of every color could walk to school without fear, where opportunity was not determined by the shade of one's skin, and where love could triumph over hatred, even in the most entrenched systems of oppression. Malcolm X, by contrast, rose from the crucible of a life scarred by systemic injustice and personal loss. He knew that words alone could not protect families from violence, nor could appeals to conscience alone dismantle centuries of discrimination. From his early years in the Nation of Islam, he preached the necessity of self-reliance, dignity, and the readiness to defend oneself against oppression. His rhetoric was sharper, his tone unyielding, but underneath it lay a profound commitment to the same fundamental goals King pursued: equality, justice, and human dignity. Malcolm's life demonstrated the power of anger transformed into purpose, of trauma converted into a demand for recognition and respect, and of individual empowerment as a precursor to collective liberation. Though the world often set them up as opposites, their philosophies began to converge as both men matured. Malcolm X's pilgrimage to Mecca marked a turning point, showing him a vision of humanity unbound by race, where solidarity and brotherhood existed without compromise to identity or pride. Upon returning, he began to speak of unity and cooperation in ways that echoed the moral appeals King had long championed, even as he continued to insist on the necessity of strength and vigilance in the face of injustice. Similarly, King, who had once placed unwavering faith in moral appeal alone, came to understand that addressing systemic oppression required challenging not only individual prejudice but the structures of economic and political power that perpetuated inequality. He expanded his vision, calling attention to poverty, war, and the broader injustices that affected marginalized communities everywhere. Their brief meeting in 1964, often overlooked, was a quiet yet profound moment of acknowledgement between two leaders whose paths, though different, were guided by the same compass. In that fleeting handshake lay an unspoken recognition that both approaches, the moral force of nonviolence and the empowering force of assertive resistance, were essential elements of the same struggle. It was a moment that symbolized a broader truth: history rarely progresses along a single path, and justice often requires both the patience to appeal to conscience and the courage to demand change. The legacies of King and Malcolm X were cemented not in abstract ideals, but in the real-world consequences of their leadership. King's dream inspired a generation to organize, march, and legislate for civil rights, demonstrating that persistent moral clarity could reshape public policy and cultural perception. Malcolm's insistence on self-respect, empowerment, and readiness to confront injustice gave voice to those whose frustration had been dismissed, legitimizing a sense of pride and agency that had long been denied. Together, they illuminated the full spectrum of struggle, one showing the transformative potential of love and moral persuasion, the other demonstrating the necessity of strength, self-determination, and unwavering courage in the face of systemic violence. Their deaths, both tragic and untimely, underscored the profound stakes of the movement they embodied. Yet even in absence, their lives continued to inform, challenge, and inspire. King's vision of a reconciled society and Malcolm's insistence on dignity and empowerment remain intertwined, teaching that meaningful progress requires the harmonization of seemingly divergent strategies. Where King encouraged the nation to rise to its higher ideals, Malcolm reminded it that without justice, those ideals remained hollow. Their legacies converge in the understanding that liberation is not singular or simple. It is multifaceted, requiring both the appeal to conscience and the assertion of rights, both love and vigilance, both moral courage and practical empowerment. Looking at the arc of their lives, it becomes clear that the tension between peace and assertive resistance was never truly a division, but a dynamic force that drove the movement forward. King and Malcolm X exemplified different expressions of the same fundamental pursuit: to awaken a nation, to uplift a people, and to insist that equality is not negotiable. They showed that courage takes many forms, and that true leadership often requires the ability to navigate complexity rather than remain confined to a single approach. Their intertwined stories remind us that social change is not linear, and that the moral and the pragmatic must coexist to challenge injustice effectively. Ultimately, the lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X reveal a profound lesson. Freedom is not achieved through a single method, and justice is not advanced by a single voice. It requires the collaboration of principles, strategies, and perspectives, each reinforcing the other, each vital to the realization of a more equitable society. Their enduring impact lies not in who was louder, who was gentler, or who was first, but in the recognition that their combined visions offer a roadmap to understanding the full complexity of struggle, resilience, and hope. By the mid-1960s, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X had come to realize that the struggle for civil rights could not be confined to streets and speeches alone. It was a battle that demanded vision, strategy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. King, long celebrated for his peaceful marches and stirring oratory, began to confront the limitations of nonviolence in a nation still deeply entrenched in systemic inequality. The victories of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were monumental, yet they revealed only the surface of oppression, leaving economic disparity, segregated housing, and educational inequity largely unaddressed. In these moments, King's rhetoric grew bolder, encompassing critiques of war, poverty, and global injustice, revealing a side of his philosophy often overshadowed by the public's expectation of calm, measured advocacy. His vision expanded beyond a dream of racial equality to a blueprint for societal transformation, one that acknowledged that freedom was meaningless without dignity, security, and opportunity for all. Malcolm X's evolution ran parallel in surprising ways. His early advocacy for black nationalism and self-defense had challenged the nation to confront its violence and hypocrisy, emphasizing the importance of self-respect and empowerment as foundations for liberation. His pilgrimage to Mecca, however, revealed a more nuanced understanding of humanity and cooperation. Witnessing people of all races praying together, treating one another with equality and respect. He recognized that liberation did not require the subjugation of others, but the affirmation of one's own worth and the construction of alliances rooted in shared human dignity. This shift did not dilute his message. Rather, it expanded it, demonstrating that strength and compassion could coexist in the pursuit of justice. He began to speak more openly about the possibilities for interracial cooperation, while never abandoning his insistence that Black Americans must claim agency over their own lives and communities. Their philosophies, though forged in different crucibles, increasingly reflected complementary insights. King's commitment to moral persuasion found resonance in Malcolm's recognition of structural necessity, and Malcolm's emphasis on empowerment found resonance in King's insistence on ethical responsibility. Both men understood that liberation was not a singular act but a continuous process, demanding courage, strategy, and the engagement of both hearts and minds. They were aware, each in his own way, that the fight for equality was as much about consciousness as it was about legislation, as much about pride and self-determination as it was about moral suasion. Even as the public narrative sought to pit them against one another, the reality was far more intricate. Their limited interactions were marked by mutual recognition and respect, each acknowledging the other's courage and insight. Malcolm X praised King's steadfastness in the face of relentless danger, while King recognized Malcolm's ability to speak truth to power and awaken a sense of agency among those who felt powerless. They shared an understanding that leadership demanded both personal sacrifice and strategic clarity, and that social change required not only moral clarity, but also the courage to confront injustice wherever it existed, whether in overt acts of violence or in the subtler structures of oppression embedded in society. The evolution of their respective strategies also underscores a profound truth about human resilience and the capacity for growth. Malcolm's journey from a posture of separatism to one embracing broader solidarity illustrates the power of experience and reflection to reshape ideology. Similarly, King's willingness to confront issues beyond race, addressing economic injustice and global oppression, demonstrates the necessity of adapting strategy to meet evolving challenges. Both men, though shaped by very different circumstances, came to recognize that the struggle for justice is not static but dynamic, requiring both reflection and action, patience and insistence, vision and pragmatism. Their deaths, abrupt and violent, deprived the world of their continued leadership. Yet their philosophies continue to inform movements for justice across the globe. King's message of moral courage and nonviolent activism remains a touchstone for advocates seeking systemic change through organized, principled action, while Malcolm's insistence on empowerment, agency, and the courage to confront structural oppression continues to inspire those who demand recognition and self-determination. Together, their legacies form a dual framework for understanding how societies change through the combination of ethical persuasion and strategic insistence, through the union of compassion and strength. In reflecting on their lives, it becomes clear that the apparent tension between peaceful protest and assertive resistance is not a dichotomy but a necessary interplay. King and Malcolm X demonstrate that effective movements require both the patience to appeal to conscience and the courage to challenge entrenched power. Both moral clarity and pragmatic resolve. One provided the ethical framework, showing the nation what justice could look like. The other provided the strategic impetus, insisting that justice must be claimed and defended. Their intertwined stories illustrate that change is rarely linear, and that true leadership often demands the ability to bridge differences in approach, while pursuing the same ultimate goal: equality, dignity, and freedom for all. Ultimately, the journeys of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X offer a profound lesson. Social progress is most powerful when diverse approaches converge in pursuit of shared principles. They remind us that courage takes multiple forms and that effective struggle requires both vision and action, heart and strategy, moral authority and assertive empowerment. In their combined legacies, we find a blueprint for meaningful change, one that honors both the strength to demand justice and the wisdom to guide it with principle. Their lives, though tragically cut short, continue to illuminate the path toward a more equitable and compassionate society, demonstrating that true freedom emerges not from a single method, but from the harmonization of multiple forces working together toward the same enduring goal. As the 1960s wore on, the paths of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm, though distinct in method, began to reflect a deeper convergence of purpose that transcended the simplistic labels the world had assigned them. King, often portrayed as the embodiment of peaceful protest, had grown increasingly aware that the victories of civil rights legislation, while historic, were only the beginning. He witnessed communities still trapped in poverty, neighborhoods still segregated, and children still denied the promise of opportunity. The moral appeals that had won attention in Birmingham and Selma were no longer sufficient on their own. The structures of inequality required more than conscience, they demanded action, courage, and an unwavering challenge to systemic oppression. King's rhetoric evolved accordingly, encompassing economic justice, opposition to war, and a broader critique of a society that permitted inequality to fester. He came to see that true freedom could not exist without confronting both the legal and economic dimensions of injustice, and that moral clarity must be coupled with strategic persistence to effect lasting change. Malcolm X, whose early life had been defined by loss, marginalization, and survival in a world often hostile to his very existence, experienced his own evolution. His pilgrimage to Mecca profoundly reshaped his understanding of humanity and the possibilities for solidarity beyond race. Witnessing worshippers of every background treating one another with equality, he recognized that liberation did not necessitate division, and that empowerment could coexist with cooperation. His speeches thereafter reflected a synthesis of the urgency he had always conveyed and a broader vision of alliance and shared human dignity. While he continued to emphasize self-reliance, pride, and vigilance against oppression, Malcolm increasingly spoke of the potential for collective action that transcended racial boundaries, offering a strategic and moral expansion of his earlier philosophy. The developments in both men's thinking highlight a remarkable symmetry. King's shift toward addressing global injustice and economic inequality mirrored Malcolm's recognition of the importance of building bridges and fostering unity without sacrificing identity. Both came to understand that the fight for justice could not be isolated to one aspect of life or one approach. The struggle was multidimensional, encompassing morality, strategy, personal empowerment, and systemic change. They demonstrated that leadership requires the courage to adapt, the willingness to broaden one's vision, and the insight to recognize that multiple approaches can advance the same ultimate goal. Their limited interactions, though brief, were rich with unspoken acknowledgement of one another's significance. Malcolm X praised King's courage to maintain moral integrity in the face of danger and social pressure, while King understood Malcolm's ability to awaken a sense of agency and self-respect among those who had been marginalized and dismissed. Each recognized that their respective approaches, though different in tone and tactic, were addressing complementary dimensions of the same struggle. One was illuminating the moral imperative of change, the other igniting the inner strength and resolve necessary to demand it. Together, they embodied the dual forces required to move a nation: conscience and courage, persuasion and power, hope and determination. The tragic assassinations of both men deprived the world of their ongoing leadership, yet their legacies have only grown in significance over time. King's vision continues to inspire movements that seek change through organized, principled action and moral clarity, demonstrating that nonviolent advocacy can reshape laws, culture, and national consciousness. Malcolm X's insistence on pride, agency, and the refusal to accept subjugation continues to empower communities to demand recognition, defend their rights, and cultivate self-determination. When viewed together, their lives offer a full spectrum of leadership and activism, one illustrating the transformative power of ethical appeals, the other emphasizing the necessity of asserting one's dignity and strength in a world that has too often denied it. Their intertwined evolution underscores an essential truth about social change. Progress rarely emerges from a single method or a solitary voice. The interplay of moral persuasion and assertive resistance, of compassion and strength, is what creates lasting transformation. King's ability to appeal to the conscience of a nation complemented Malcolm's ability to awaken the conscience of the oppressed. One taught that love could illuminate injustice. The other taught that courage could confront it directly. Their lives, together, demonstrate that change requires a synthesis of strategy and principle. That liberation is as much about moral awakening as it is about empowerment, and that true leadership often lies in the capacity to harmonize diverse approaches toward a shared vision. Looking at the arc of their journeys, it becomes evident that their evolving philosophies were not contradictions but extensions of the same ultimate pursuit: justice, equality, and dignity for all. King's expansion into global and economic concerns reflected the need to address structural inequities, while Malcolm's shift toward unity and strategic cooperation reflected the realization that empowerment is most effective when paired with solidarity. Both men, through their growth, illuminated different dimensions of the same truth. Meaningful change requires a combination of ethical clarity, practical action, personal courage, and collective effort. Their combined legacies continue to teach and inspire because they embody the dynamic nature of struggle. Freedom, they show us, is not achieved through a single tactic or perspective, but through the collaboration of principles and actions that address the complexity of oppression. King and Malcolm X remind us that the path to justice is not linear or singular, and that enduring progress is forged when the moral and the strategic, the compassionate and the assertive, work together in pursuit of a society where every individual can claim the dignity, equality, and freedom that is their birthright. In their intertwined lives, the world sees a blueprint for meaningful change, one that honors both the strength to demand justice and the wisdom to guide it with principle, demonstrating that the pursuit of equality requires both courage and conscience in equal measure. By the late 1960s, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X had transformed in ways that reflected the evolving challenges of the civil rights movement and the broader struggle for justice. King, long revered as the moral compass of nonviolent activism, had begun to confront the deeper layers of inequality that legislation alone could not resolve. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act had opened doors. Yet poverty, segregation, and systemic disenfranchisement persisted. King's speeches began to weave together critiques of economic injustice, the Vietnam War, and global oppression, signaling an awareness that freedom could not exist in isolation from dignity, opportunity, and security. His moral vision expanded, emphasizing that a society cannot claim justice while permitting vast inequalities to endure, and that activism required both ethical clarity and practical engagement to dismantle entrenched systems of oppression. Malcolm X, who had once stood as the voice of uncompromising defiance and black nationalism, underwent a parallel transformation that mirrored King's expanding understanding. His pilgrimage to Mecca reshaped his perspective on human interconnectedness and the potential for cross-racial solidarity, revealing that liberation could be pursued without abandoning the necessity of self-respect and empowerment. He began to speak of unity, cooperation, and the shared pursuit of justice, while still insisting that Black Americans must assert control over their own communities and destiny. Malcolm's evolution did not temper his demand for dignity or his call for vigilance. Rather, it enriched his philosophy, showing that strength and compassion, self-determination and solidarity could coexist in a movement striving for true equality. The seeming divergence between the two men, long amplified by media narratives, belied the underlying harmony of their intentions. King's strategy of appealing to the moral conscience of the nation complemented Malcolm's insistence on empowerment and self-determination. One sought to awaken the conscience of the oppressor. The other sought to awaken the courage of the oppressed. And together they created a fuller, more dynamic blueprint for social change. Both understood that transformation required multiple approaches: moral persuasion to illuminate injustice, assertive resistance to challenge it, and personal and collective courage to sustain the struggle through setbacks and opposition. Their limited interactions carried a quiet, profound significance. When they met in 1964, the handshake between King and Malcolm symbolized more than personal acknowledgement. It represented the recognition that their respective paths were not mutually exclusive but complementary. King admired Malcolm's ability to awaken a sense of agency and pride among those who had been silenced and marginalized, while Malcolm respected King's moral courage and his capacity to inspire conscience-driven action in the broader society. Each understood that leadership required both vision and strategy, and that a movement seeking justice needed to harness the strengths of diverse approaches, rather than reduce the struggle to a singular method. The assassinations of both men, though tragic and untimely, crystallized their legacies. King's dream of a reconciled, just society and Malcolm's insistence on empowerment and agency continue to influence generations. Their combined impact demonstrates that meaningful social change requires the harmonization of ethical advocacy and assertive insistence. King's ability to appeal to the hearts of a nation provided moral clarity and inspiration, while Malcolm's call for self-determination and resilience ensured that communities possessed the strength to demand and claim their rights. Together, they embodied the duality necessary for liberation: conscience and courage, persuasion and empowerment, hope and unyielding determination. The convergence of their evolving philosophies reveals a profound truth about the nature of struggle and leadership. Change is rarely linear, and progress is rarely achieved through a single tactic. King and Malcolm X exemplify how seemingly divergent approaches can intersect to advance a shared goal, demonstrating that both ethical clarity and strategic assertiveness are essential to challenge systemic oppression effectively. King's broadened critique of societal inequities and Malcolm's nuanced embrace of cross-racial solidarity illustrate that the most enduring movements are those that integrate multiple dimensions of thought and action. Their intertwined legacies offer a roadmap for understanding the complexities of social change. True liberation requires the courage to confront injustice directly, the moral authority to guide action, the wisdom to adapt strategy to evolving challenges, and the persistence to sustain efforts despite obstacles and setbacks. King and Malcolm X together exemplify these qualities, showing that leadership is as much about principle as it is about strategy, as much about inspiring hearts as it is about empowering communities to act. They remind us that the fight for justice cannot be reduced to a binary of peaceful versus militant, but must embrace the full spectrum of human courage, intellect, and moral insight. Reflecting on their journeys, it becomes evident that their lives, though tragically cut short, provide enduring lessons in unity, resilience, and the multifaceted nature of advocacy. King taught the world that love and moral conviction could illuminate injustice and catalyze systemic change, while Malcolm taught that strength, self-respect, and assertive action are necessary to claim the rights that justice demands. Their stories converge to show that liberation requires both the appeal to conscience and the assertion of agency, both compassion and determination, both vision and strategy. By harmonizing these forces, they created a legacy that transcends their time, offering insight into how society can confront inequality, inspire action, and build a more equitable world. Ultimately, the evolution of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X underscores that meaningful change demands a synthesis of perspectives, a willingness to learn, and a courage to act. Their intertwined philosophies reveal that freedom and justice are achieved not through a single path or a single voice, but through the dynamic interplay of ethical conviction, practical action, and unyielding dedication. Together, they illuminate the enduring truth that liberation is most profound when it engages both the heart and the mind, both moral clarity and assertive empowerment, providing a blueprint for enduring social transformation that continues to resonate today. The story of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X is not simply a tale of two men with different approaches. It is a story of vision, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice that continues to resonate across generations. Their lives, though marked by tragedy and sacrifice, illuminate the many paths that lead toward freedom and equality, revealing that the struggle for justice is never one-dimensional, and that meaningful change requires both moral conviction and strategic action. King and Malcolm X remind us that the fight against oppression is as much about transforming hearts as it is about transforming systems, and that real progress requires both the courage to confront injustice and the wisdom to guide that confrontation with principle. Martin Luther King Jr., with his unwavering commitment to nonviolence, showed the world that moral clarity could be a powerful instrument of change. Through his speeches, marches, and tireless advocacy, he illuminated the deep contradictions within a society that claimed freedom while tolerating discrimination and segregation. King's vision was not limited to legal equality. It encompassed a moral awakening, an appeal to conscience, and a belief that the transformation of society begins with the transformation of hearts. His leadership inspired millions to act with dignity, courage, and persistence, showing that patience, hope, and steadfast ethical principles can confront even the most entrenched injustices. Malcolm X, by contrast, demonstrated the necessity of empowerment, self-respect, and assertive resistance in the pursuit of justice. His early life had been defined by hardship, marginalization, and systemic violence, experiences that forged in him a voice that could articulate the anger and frustration of a community long silenced. Through his insistence on pride, dignity, and self-determination, Malcolm X empowered countless individuals to recognize their own worth and claim their rights. His transformation after his pilgrimage to Mecca added layers of insight and compassion to his message, showing that strength and cooperation, vigilance and solidarity, could coexist in the pursuit of liberation. Malcolm's life was a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of self-assertion, and the need for communities to demand justice actively rather than passively wait for it. Together, the legacies of King and Malcolm X create a complete portrait of leadership and activism. One demonstrates the transformative power of love and moral authority, while the other highlights the necessity of courage and assertive action. One teaches that conscience can awaken a nation, while the other teaches that empowerment can awaken a people. Their lives intersect in the understanding that liberation requires both the appeal to ethics and the exercise of agency, that progress is built when compassion meets resolve, and that meaningful change demands both vision and action. These lessons remain vital today, as the struggles for equality, justice, and human dignity continue around the world. Their stories also emphasize the complexity of social change, showing that progress is rarely linear or simple. The civil rights movement, shaped in part by their leadership, required multiple approaches, strategies, and voices to confront deeply entrenched systems of oppression. King and Malcolm illustrate that leadership is not about uniformity or agreement on tactics, but about alignment in purpose and clarity of vision. They remind us that movements are strengthened when diverse perspectives complement one another, and that enduring change emerges from the interplay of ethical conviction, personal courage, and collective action. In reflecting on their contributions, we recognize that the true measure of their impact lies not only in the reforms they inspired, but in the values they embodied. Integrity, resilience, empathy, and the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. King and Malcolm has both faced immense danger, personal sacrifice, and societal resistance, yet they persisted in their missions, leaving behind a legacy that transcends time and place. They teach us that the pursuit of justice is a lifelong endeavor, that every voice matters, and that meaningful transformation requires both courage and conscience, strength and principle, determination and wisdom. As we honor their memory and carry forward the lessons of their lives, we are reminded that the responsibility to continue their work rests with each of us. Their messages call us to action, to challenge inequality wherever we see it, to uplift those whose voices are marginalized, and to commit ourselves to building a more just, equitable, and compassionate world. The paths of King and Malcolm X converge in a shared truth that justice cannot be deferred, that freedom must be claimed, and that lasting change demands both heart and resolve. Thank you for taking the time to explore the lives and legacies of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X with us. Their stories are not only historical records but living lessons, reminding us that the fight for justice continues and that every act of courage, compassion, and advocacy contributes to a better world. If their journeys inspired you, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing, so we can continue sharing stories that illuminate the struggles, triumphs, and enduring lessons of history. Together, we can keep their legacies alive, honor their vision, and carry forward the work of building a society rooted in equality, dignity, and human potential.